Welcome, and thank you for joining Home Program COVID-19 related suspensions and waivers. Before we begin, please ensure you've opened the WebEx participant and chat panels using the associated icons located at the bottom of your screen. Please note that all audio connections are muted at this time. You are, however, welcome to submit written questions throughout today's presentation. To submit a question, select all panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel, enter your questions in the message box provided, and send. Should you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. With that, I'll turn the conference over to Janet Goldrick, Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Grant Programs. Please.
Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Janet Goldrick. I'm the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Grant Programs. I'd like to welcome you to the Home Program COVID-19 response, in particular looking at waivers of suspensions and authorities. And with that, there's a lot to present today, so we want to thank you very much for participating in this call. And I will turn it over to John Gibbs, the Acting Assistant Secretary for Community Planning and Development.
Thank you, Janet. I'm John Gibbs, the Acting Assistant Secretary for CPD here at HUD, as Janet has just shared. And on behalf of Secretary Carson, I want to thank you for being a part of today's call, and thank you for being on the front lines and responding to this crisis. It is because of your hard work that we are going to prevail. Beyond the ongoing health crisis occurring in communities across the country, the social distancing measures adopted in response to this crisis have had a devastating impact on businesses and workers. In fact, in the past month, an unprecedented 22 million people across the country have filed for unemployment. Many families who were employed and stably housed previously are suddenly experiencing an unprecedented financial crisis. In response to this crisis, on April 10th, I approved a comprehensive package of statutory suspensions and regulatory waivers for the HOME program. These changes are intended to provide home participating jurisdictions with flexibility to quickly reprogram funds and assist families affected by the pandemic, stabilize the economic condition of both those families and your existing portfolios of home projects, and enable you to protect the health of your staff and your community by maintaining social distancing. I particularly encourage you to consider reprogramming home funds that you already have available in your federal accounts to provide emergency rental assistance to families who have experienced sudden income loss. Thank you again for the hard work you're doing in your jurisdictions, and thank you to Janet, Jenny, and the entire CBD team here at HUD who have been doing really, really fantastic work to make sure that you have what you need to address this crisis. I'm now going to turn the program over to staff from our Office of Affordable Housing Programs here at HUD. Thank you.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary. I would now like to introduce Jenny Sardone. She is the Office Director of the Office of Affordable Housing Programs, and she will lead the presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet and John. Hope to see you in person again sometime very soon. As Janet mentioned, my name is Jenny Sardone. I'm the Director of the Office of Affordable Housing Programs. I've met many of you over the years, and I'm here today with two of my staff. Diane Thompson, who's the Assistant Director of the Program Policy Division in OAHP, and Martha Murray, who's a Senior Affordable Housing Specialist. Diane and Martha were the authors of the two memos, and so they're going to be walking you through those today. Okay, so today's agenda. I know that most of you are on the line because you want to hear about the statutory suspensions and the waivers that we issued a couple of weeks ago. However, we're going to start off today by talking about something that you're probably much less familiar with, and that is the CARES Act eviction moratorium on federal housing, properties supported by federal housing programs. Then we'll move on and talk about the package of general statutory suspensions and regulatory waivers. And then finally, we're going to walk you through the tenant-based rental assistance package that we put together. We have a very large number of people on the phone today. We ended up adding 800 lines just today. And so we have probably about 1,800 people. So we're going to hold questions to the very end. And, obviously with that many participants, we probably have a very limited ability to provide answers on this webinar to your questions. We got many questions sent in ahead of time, and we tried to the best of our ability to make sure that we are covering the answers to your questions as we go along. But if we have time at the end of the presentation, we'll definitely take additional questions, so please hold those. Okay. The eviction moratorium. So many of you are familiar with the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, called the CARES Act, which was signed into law on March 27th. And you're probably aware of it primarily because of the supplemental funding that it is providing to your communities through CDBG, COC, HOPWA, and other federal housing programs. However, there is also provision in that law that protects tenants who are unable to pay rent. Specifically, the Act establishes a 120-day federal eviction moratorium for tenants of covered dwelling units in properties assisted by federal housing programs. And so those properties really fall into two categories. First, properties that have federally backed mortgage loans as defined in the CARES Act. And second, properties that are assisted by covered housing programs as defined in the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA. So what we're going to focus on is what projects and units are subject to the moratorium and what the moratorium either prohibits or requires. So how is home affected? First of all, home is a covered housing program under VAWA. Therefore, units in home rental projects and home TBRA units are considered covered dwelling units. And then second, in addition, a home loan that is secured on a multifamily rental project is considered a federally backed multifamily mortgage under Section 4024A5 of the CARES Act. And all dwelling units in such a project are considered covered dwelling units for the purpose of this moratorium. And then next, there's some coverage of home ownership projects that have been assisted with home. Specifically, home ownership projects that also include rental units. So a duplex, a triplex, any kind of a home ownership project where we provided assistance that also has rental units. So it could be up to 3 rental units. If there's a loan on that property, that loan is considered a federally backed mortgage loan, and also these would be covered dwelling units under VAWA. So this is fairly complicated. So what units are covered by the moratorium? Home-assisted rental projects currently within a period of affordability, as specified in the home written agreement, are covered by the eviction moratorium. And this would include projects that have written agreements that impose extended periods of affordability beyond the period of affordability that's specified in the home regulations. So as an example of this, many affordable housing projects in California carry a 55-year period of affordability, even though the home periods of affordability do not exceed 20 years by regulation. So if you as a participating jurisdiction have imposed extended periods of affordability on your properties, they are still covered under the eviction moratorium. Second, rental projects that received home funds that are no longer within a period of affordability but still have a home loan within its term of repayment and secured on the property as either a first or subordinate lien. So let's say you did a new construction project with home funds. It had a 20-year period of affordability, and that period of affordability is over. but the loan that you place and the lien that you have on the property, even if it's, whether it's in first position or fifth position, that property is still covered under this eviction moratorium by virtue of the loan, not the period of affordability. Next, homeownership projects. So projects that we funded for acquisition or acquisition rehab, or even homeowner rehab loans that contain rental units, as I mentioned before, and these projects are either within their period of affordability or they have a loan that is still within its term of repayment secured on the property. And then, obviously, units occupied by recipients of tenant-based rental assistance are covered by the moratorium. So, don't often do this on a webinar, but we have the same slide, sort of repeating the same information in a slightly different way, because I think that's fairly confusing. So, in review, home-assisted units in a project that are subject to the moratorium for the following: home rental projects under a period of affordability or an extended period of affordability. Rental projects that are outside of the home period of affordability but still have a home loan secured by a lien and within the repayment period. And homeownership projects within the period of affordability and or with a home loan secured by the lien within the repayment period. Hopefully that's slightly more plain English than the last slide was. There is a question, however, that remains unanswered, but I didn't want to not at least address it. The eviction moratorium statutory language is proving to be quite complex, and there are still aspects of it that are under close legal review here by the lawyers at HUD. And so one of the sort of potential effects of the CARES Act that we know that we need to address with you, but we don't have definitive guidance as of today, is exactly how the CARES Act will apply to non-home units in home-assisted projects. So that is still a matter under legal review. We will be providing you additional guidance on that. We'll be issuing a series of FAQs on the moratorium, and we will not issue those FAQs until we have that answer. So please stay tuned. But we didn't want to not address what some may feel is the elephant in the room, which is what is the impact of the moratorium on units that are not considered to be home-assisted but are located in a home-assisted project. And then for tenant-based rental assistance, for projects that are privately owned, non-federally funded, only the units occupied by the home tenant-based rental assistance recipient is subject to the moratorium. So if it's a home project and there's a home TBRA client in a unit, that is a different answer. But if it's simply an unassisted rental unit in a rental project, the moratorium only applies to the unit occupied by the TBRA recipient. Okay, so what does the moratorium prohibit, or what does it require? From March 27th, which is the date the law was passed and signed into law, to July 24th, owners and or lessors of covered home assisted projects or units occupied by a home TBRA recipient are prohibited from either initiating eviction for non-payment of rent or non-payment of other fees or charges by filing suit in the court of jurisdiction, and they're also prohibited from charging fees, penalties, or other charges to tenants related to the non-payment of rent. So no late fees may be assessed during this moratorium period. Now, if the owner did not provide the tenant with an eviction notice for non-payment of rent or other fees before March 27th, the owner may not issue such a notice until after July 24th. However, if the owner issued an eviction notice to a tenant for non-payment of rent or non-payment of other fees and charges and filed an eviction claim with a court of jurisdiction before March 27th, the home statute and regulations require a 30-day written notice for eviction. However, that eviction can move forward after the 30-day requirement for the home program has been met. So, what do PJs have to do to implement the eviction moratorium? PJs should notify owners of projects covered by the moratorium or rental units occupied by TBRA recipients of their obligations under the CARES Act. So one way, HUD will be issuing FAQs explaining everything that I've covered, and some of the issues that I've mentioned are still under review. And so one way of notifying your owners would be to send them that FAQ. The moratorium does not have much of an effect if the owners who are subject to it are not aware of it. So we definitely want you to make that notification and make it in writing, so that they know that they are not able to pursue eviction of tenants in these covered home projects and TBRA units. So I know that there's a lot of unanswered questions on the eviction moratorium. Hopefully that FAQ will answer some of the issues left unaddressed in today's presentation. And if not, please do send us questions if there's anything about this that you don't understand. We're going to move on to home program suspensions and waivers. So, as many of you know, HUD has statutory suspension authority under the National Affordable Housing Act, which is our authorizing statute. That permits us to suspend certain statutory requirements to address damage in areas declared a major disaster under the Stafford Act. We've used that extensively in a lot of areas where there have been tornadoes and hurricanes, and there are PJs in certain areas of the country that have received those kinds of suspensions in the past. They're very familiar with them. And others where you were fortunate enough not to have experienced natural disasters, and you've probably never seen those before. Our statute does prohibit us from suspending statutory requirements related to affordability, income targeting, environment, fair housing, labor standards, so Davis-Bacon, are things that we cannot suspend. And you'll notice in the memos that we break out sort of the statutory suspensions from the waivers, because only PJs that are the subject of statutory suspension can take it up, of a disaster declaration, can take advantage of a statutory suspension. As of today, all 50 states and most territories have a disaster declaration. So there are probably only a couple PJs out there that cannot take advantage of everything that is in both of those waivers memos that we provided. And then we have regulatory authority to waive regulations subject to statutory limitations upon a finding of good cause. So that's the authority that we use, those two authorities, in those two memos. And as I mentioned, these are things that we've used in the past in response to tornadoes and hurricanes and similar types of natural disasters. And so they've generally been related to long-term recovery, so either the repair or the replacement of housing that was damaged in a natural disaster. However, this is a very different situation that we're all facing. This pandemic, has created really urgent housing needs, but they're a very different type of housing need than what we've dealt with previously through the use of suspensions and waivers. So we had to think really hard about how home could be used for immediate response to this unprecedented and sudden economic downturn that has created these, the housing needs that we're all trying to address right now. Millions of people who've lost their livelihood. And so as we thought about this, what we really determined would be the way that homes could contribute to these efforts was to increase home funding for administrative costs. We're well aware that many of you use CDBG funding to pay for home administrative and project soft costs. And obviously CDBG has many more flexible uses appropriate to COVID-19 response. So we wanted to be able to free up some of the CDBG funds or even the general funds that you use to support homes. We're concerned about the long-term sustainability of CHODOs. We all know that many CHODOs struggle to maintain staff capacity, and in the current situation, maintaining staff capacity and, frankly, organizational capacity it was very over the long term so that they can function in the future in the home program seemed to us to be very important. We wanted to maximize the availability of funding that you already have available to you in your federal account for COVID-19 response, reduce administrative obstacles to providing assistance, facilitate social distancing to protect your own staff and also your tenants, provide relief from deadlines, and then very importantly, and maybe something that not everyone has thought about very much as of yet, is the need to stabilize the financial condition of existing home rental projects that are out there under a period of affordability. You've invested a great deal in these to create these projects in the past, and the sudden fall off of rent revenue may adversely affect and potentially threaten the ongoing financial viability of those projects. And then finally, to facilitate TBRA. And so we thought about those things, and those were our goals. We announced the availability of waivers and suspensions to address what those priorities were in the two memos that were issued and signed by Acting Assistant Secretary John Gibbs on April 10th. And so I'm going to turn it over in just a second to Diane and to Martha to walk you through those waivers and suspensions. But I did want to note before I do so that before using those suspensions and waivers, you're required to notify your local field office in writing via the notification mailbox established for that purpose. So in order to consolidate all of these notifications that we're getting for all types of waivers and suspensions across all of CPD's programs, a mailbox has been created for each field office. We're asking you to send your notifications to the mailbox created for your field office. You can find it at the URL that is at the bottom of the slide. And it's absolutely critical that you do make that notification. To the extent that you take advantage of some of these waivers and suspensions, my office will be required to make changes in IDIS that permits you to either use more admin or less CHODO. And so please give some thought to which of the waivers and suspensions you feel would be appropriate for you to take advantage of, and let your field office know so they can notify us as well. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Diane, if I can figure out how to do that. Do you have control, Diane?
I do, Jenny. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm just going to start off with a brief introduction. So the memorandum that was issued on April 10th, 2020, it's divided into two sections. It covers a total of 12 suspensions and waivers. This first section of the memo covers the 4 home statutory suspensions that are available to PJs with disaster declarations. And the second covers 8 waivers of program requirements that are available to all home PJs. But as Jenny mentioned, at this point, it's basically a distinction without a difference because since issuing the memorandum, all states with the exception of the American Samoa now have major disaster declarations that cover the entire state. So with that brief introduction, let me just get right into the statutory suspensions. And the first one that's available to PJs is the statutory and regulatory limits on the use of home funds for administrative costs to 10%. It's limited to 10% of the annual home allocation. The suspension, it increases that limit to enable PJs to expend up to 25% of its FY 2019 and 2020 home allocations as well as program income for administrative costs. So HUD suspended the requirement to relieve PJs of the burden of identifying other general funds to pay home administrative and planning costs when general operating revenue is declining at this time because state and local tax revenue is decreasing as a result of attempts to prevent the spread of the virus. HUD also suspended the requirement, as Jenny mentioned, in order to eliminate the need for PJs to use CDBG funds to support administrative costs that are associated with the home program, thereby freeing up CDBG money to be used for CDBG permissible activities. The increase to 25%, we believe it should provide PJs adequate funds to pay for the increased cost of administering home-related activities to address the effects of COVID-19. So PJs that choose to implement the suspension must document implementation of the waiver in its program files and must maintain records demonstrating compliance with the 25% limit. The second statutory suspension is to the statutory and regulatory requirements to use 15% of each annual allocation, of home funds for housing owned, developed, or sponsored by CHODOs. The suspension, it reduces the set-aside requirement to 0% for fiscal years 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020 home allocations. And HUD suspended the requirement in order to allow the use of funds that would otherwise be set aside for CHODOs to expeditiously assist families affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. The suspension was provided to also allow for funding of activities like TBRA, for which CHODO funds cannot be used otherwise. So PJs that choose to implement this suspension must document implementation of the waiver in its program files. The third statutory suspension involves the limits and conditions on CHODO operating expense assistance. Under the home program regulations, CHODO operating assistance is limited to 5% of each home allocation, and in combination with assistance for organizational support and CHODO capacity building, is limited to the greater of 50% of a CHODO's operating budget, or $50,000. If the CHODO is not receiving CHODO set-aside assistance for a specific project at the time of receipt of CHODO operating assistance, it's expected that the CHODO receive set-aside funding for a specific project within 24 months of receiving CHODO operating assistance. As a matter of fact, PJs must include that in the written agreement with the CHODO. So the suspension permits PJs to provide a greater percentage of its home allocation for CHODO operating expense assistance. It's up from 5% to 10% under the waiver of its fiscal year 2019 and fiscal year 2020 home allocations. The suspension also permits PJs to provide operating expense assistance in an amount that exceeds the $50,000 or the 50% cap of a CHODO's operating budget. And the suspension eliminates the requirement that CHODOs receiving operating assistance be expected to receive CHODO set-aside funding for a project within 24 months of receiving the operating assistance. The suspension is applicable to fiscal years 2019 and 2020 allocations for expenses incurred by the CHODO through June 30th, 2021. HUD suspended the requirements in order to ensure that CHODOs are able to maintain operations and retain staff capacity to own, develop, and sponsor housing with CHODO set-aside funds that serve communities impacted by the pandemic. PJs must ensure increased operating assistance is used by CHODOs to maintain organizational capacity during COVID-19. They must maintain records demonstrating compliance with the suspension, and PJs must document implementation of the waiver in its program file. The final statutory suspension involves the match requirement. The statute and regulation require that each participating jurisdiction must make contributions to housing that qualifies as affordable housing under the home program throughout a fiscal year. The contributions must total not less than 25% of the funds drawn from the jurisdiction's home investment trust fund treasury account in that fiscal year. The statutory suspension reduces the match contribution requirement by 100% for fiscal years 2020 and 2021. The reduction applies to funds that are expended by the PJ between October 1st, 2019 and September 30th, 2021. And we're waiving program requirements concerning match in order to relieve PJs from the need to identify and provide matching contributions to home projects during a time of urgent housing and economic needs created by the COVID-19 pandemic and the substantial financial impact that PJs will face in addressing those needs. Again, the PJ must document implementation of the waiver in its program files. So the first regulatory waiver, it's not a statutory suspension, involves the requirement that a PJ must follow its citizens' participation plan to provide reasonable notice and opportunity to comment for substantial amendments to its consolidated plan. The waiver, it allows a PJ to reduce the citizen comment period to 5 days when amending its consolidated plan and action plan as a result of actions that the PJ is taking to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. The waiver, it applies to any necessary amendments to FY 2020 and earlier consolidated plans or action plans. The waiver is provided to allow PJs to quickly reprogram home funds to activities that more directly meet their immediate housing needs caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. PJs must provide a 5-day public comment period if any amendments constitute a substantial amendment under the jurisdiction's definition of a substantial amendment. The PJ must document implementation, again, of the waiver in its program files. The next waiver has to do with documentation required for income determination. The home regulations require PJs to determine initial income using 2 months source documentation. The waiver permits PJs to use self-certification of income in lieu of using 2 months of source documentation to determine initial income. The waiver applies to families that have lost employment or income as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic who are applying for admission to home rental units or the TBRA program. The waiver only applies to applicants for rental units and TBRA and does not apply to applicants for homebuyer housing or to homeowners receiving rehabilitation assistance. The waiver is necessary because many families affected by actions taken to reduce the spread of COVID-19, such as business closures, which have resulted in lost income, will not have documentation that accurately reflects current income, and such families would not otherwise be able to qualify for home assistance if the waiver was not granted. Since the waiver covers families that have lost income as a result of the pandemic, PJs must make sure self-certification includes how the applicant's financial situation has changed as a result of the pandemic and include all income received by the applicant, including any unemployment or emergency benefits received, excluding stimulus payments. And we've just generically characterized any benefits that individuals may receive as a result of the pandemic as emergency benefits, since we don't know what other benefits may be created by Congress. For applicants to rental projects that self-certify income, PJs must conduct on-site rent and income reviews within 90 days after the waiver period. And PJs must include tenant income certifications in the project files and, again, document implementation of the waiver in its program files. The next waiver involves on-site reviews and inspections of home-assisted rental housing. PJs are required to perform on-site inspections of units and verify income and rent information every 3 years. The waiver of ongoing periodic inspections of home-assisted rental housing extends the time frame for PJs to perform ongoing periodic inspections and on-site reviews to determine compliance with property standards and rent and income requirements, respectively. The waiver does not apply to initial inspections and only applies to on-site verification of rent and income if the project owner is unable to make the required documentation available electronically. The waiver is effective through December 31st, 2020. And HUD granted the waiver to perform on-site inspections to help protect staff and reduce the spread of COVID-19. PJs must perform physical inspections of rental units within 120 days of the end of the waiver and document implementation of the waiver in its project file. Next is the waiver of annual inspections of units occupied by recipients of home TBRA. To ensure TBRA-assisted rental units are being maintained in decent, safe, and in a sanitary manner, the regulation requires PJs to conduct annual housing quality standard inspections of units. The waiver eliminates the requirement to conduct annual HQS inspections on units occupied by families receiving home TBRA from April 10th, 2020, the date of the memo, through December 31st, 2020. And HUD waived this requirement in order to protect the health of both inspectors and TBRA tenants by observing physical distancing recommendations to limit the spread of COVID-19. PJs must take reasonable efforts to address tenant-reported health and safety issues during the waiver period. They must also conduct annual inspections that would have been performed during the waiver period within 120 days following the end of the waiver period. They must document implementation of the waiver in its program files. So for both this waiver and the waiver discussed before this one, that is the on-site reviews and inspections, we highly recommend that PJs use discretion based on local conditions on the timing of inspections in case there's a second wave, hopefully not, but in case there's a second wave of the virus in the fall or the winter that may prevent PJs from performing inspections within 120 days of the waiver. So if there's a period of time in the summer, for example, when the risk decreases, PJs may want to consider performing the inspections at that time. Next, the Department is waiving the 4-year project completion deadline that requires completion of a project within 4 years of the date of commitment of funds. If the deadline is not met and the PJ does not request a 1-year extension prior to the deadline, the project is considered to be terminated and the PJ must repay all funds invested in the project to its home investment trust fund. So the waiver of those regulations applies to projects with deadlines occurring between April 10, 2020 and December 31st, 2020. It extends such deadlines to December 31st and suspends the enforcement of termination and repayment for failure to complete those projects covered by the waiver. And we granted this waiver because we recognize that the COVID-19 pandemic will have an impact on development schedules for several potential reasons, including worker illness or efforts to reduce the spread of COVID-19, such as smaller construction crews or even delays in local permitting or inspections due to government office closures. PJs must document implementation of this waiver in its program files. Okay, so the next waiver also involves a deadline. The 9-month deadline for sale of home buyer units is also waived. The regulations require that a home buyer housing unit developed with home funds have a ratified contract for sale to an eligible home buyer within 9 months of the date of completion of construction or rehabilitation. If not, the regulation requires the housing to be rented to an eligible tenant. The waiver extends the requirement for a ratified sales contract within 9 months of completion of construction or rehab for deadlines occurring between April 10, 2020 and December 31st, 2020. The waiver also suspends the enforcement action of conversion to rental units for failure to meet the deadline for projects covered by the waiver. And HUD granted this waiver because HUD recognizes that the pandemic could have an impact on the ability of eligible households to obtain mortgages because of loss of income, also because of such things as title searches being delayed, inspections and closings. All of those are likely to be delayed because of business closures in an attempt to stop the spread of COVID-19. The waiver does not waive the requirement for housing counseling, however, and it does not waive the requirement for eligibility determination. The PJ must document implementation of the waiver in its program files. The next waiver has to do with the requirements to receive relief under the Troubled Home Projects Regulations. The home regulations include provisions to permit home rental projects that are not financially viable to be preserved through the use of home funds to recapitalize project reserves. HUD must review market needs, available resources, and the likelihood of long-term viability of the project. Under the regulation, a written memorandum of agreement between HUD and the PJ is a precondition of funding. And the memorandum of agreement, it limits the funding amount as well. So HUD determined that a waiver of these requirements is necessary to enable PJs to take rapid action to preserve the financial viability of home-assisted affordable rental units that are currently under a home period of affordability. Jenny touched on this in her introduction to these waivers. Because existing tenants in home units may be unable to meet their rent obligations due to the economic impact of COVID-19, home rental projects may experience operating deficits due to the sudden decrease in rental revenue. Specifically, the waiver, it eliminates requirements to obtain HUD approval and execute a memorandum of agreement before providing assistance to preserve the financial viability of a project by recapitalizing operating deficit reserves. The waiver applies to home projects within the period of affordability. PJs will not be required to obtain HUD approval to execute the memorandum of agreement with HUD before providing assistance to the project. Home assistance that can be provided under the waiver applies to the number of home-assisted units in the project for the period beginning April 1st, 2020 and ending December 31st, 2020. So the method used to determine the maximum amount of of assistance is a little detailed. So I'm not going to go over it here, but it is described in the April 10th waiver memorandum. In order to exercise the waiver authority, owners must agree to forego distributions of residual receipts through the waiver period in 6 months thereafter. Rights under, they have to also agree to forego any rights under the lease or state or local law to take legal action for non-payment of rent and collection of late fees. And owners must also not report non-payment of rent or fees to credit bureaus. So the PJ must determine operating deficits not covered by business disruption insurance or other sources. The PJ must also determine the maximum home assistance to be provided, require documentation of operating expenses through acceptable documentation, which the waiver does list the types of acceptable documentation, and must maintain such documentation. The PJ must amend the home written agreement. The PJ must review project records and require repayment for ineligible costs and any reserve balance after the waiver period. The PJ must also deposit repay funds in their local home account and receipt it as program income in IDIS. And PJs must also establish and maintain record of implementation of the waiver during the waiver period. The final waiver under the April 10th memorandum permits HUD to provide PJs extended response period to findings of noncompliance. The regulation requires notification and opportunity for response to HUD determinations of noncompliance within a time period prescribed by HUD, but limits the period to no more than 30 days. The waiver allows HUD to give PJs more than 30 days to respond, and it applies to home regulatory noncompliance notifications issued between April 10th, 2020 and December 31st, 2020. And HUD believes that this waiver is necessary because of the unanticipated circumstances created by the COVID-19 pandemic and the need of PJs to focus staff time on housing needs arising out of the pandemic. HUD will specify the extended response time in any findings notice that's issued, and HUD will also entertain requests for extensions of time periods that were imposed before the April 10th, 2020 memorandum. So with that, I will turn it over to Martha.
Thank you, Diane. Hello, welcome everyone. I'm going to talk about our second memo, which included the home TBRA, statutory suspensions, and regulatory waivers. Before we start, I want to do a little bit of an overview. So there's a bit of overlap between Diane's waiver, the general home waiver, and the TBRA waivers that I'm going to discuss shortly. We wanted to make sure that the TBRA waivers and suspensions sort of stood on their own so you could get a complete picture of how home TBRA is supposed to work during this pandemic. So you'll see a couple of slides in here that are sort of repetitive of Diane's, and that's because the waiver was included in both the general home memo as well as the home TBRA memo. So these waivers are designed to allow PJs to address the urgent housing needs of individuals and families facing sudden financial hardship as a result of the pandemic. Consequently, there's a limited time frame on the availability of these waivers. You keep hearing us talking about the April 10th, 2020 date of the memo, and these waivers are applicable from that date through December 31st, 2020. So that's the window that we're looking at. These waivers apply to any TBRA provided during that time frame. PJs do have the option to renew the TBRA contract with the tenant following that December 31st, 2020 waiver period, but unless HUD extends these waivers and suspensions, all home requirements will apply to the unit and the household. It's important also to note that we're targeting essentially 3 different populations with these waivers and suspension. The first, individuals and families that are seeking immediate housing. So those that are not currently housed but are in need of shelter. We're also looking to assist households that are currently housed and not receiving assistance, but who are now unable to pay their rent or their utilities because they've lost a job or their wages are somehow reduced as a result of the pandemic. And then finally, also assist existing TBRA households who now may need additional assistance because they also have lost wages or jobs. It is important to note that TBRA cannot be used to provide housing in hotels, motels, or dorms. We have some statutory language and regulatory language that requires us to provide home assistance in permanent housing. So no hotels, motels, or dorms or other similar non-permanent structures. PJ is interested in implementing the home TBRA suspensions and waivers, must ensure that their tenants are still low income, but we're going to talk about sort of a waiver that we've applied to that in a minute. And they also have to execute a rental assistance contract for a mutually agreed upon time frame, but not to exceed the December 31st, 2020 waiver period. So they could have a rental assistance contract from the April 10th, 2020 date of this waiver through December 31st, 2020, and these waivers will apply during that period. After that date, if these waivers are not extended, PJ has the option to renew the contract, but all home requirements will apply. So keep those points in mind as we walk through these slides. The home statute requires that a PJ that intends to use home funds for TBRA certify that such assistance is an essential part of its consolidated plan based on an analysis of local market conditions. Further, when amending its con plan, a PJ must follow its citizen participation plan by providing citizens with reasonable notice and an opportunity to comment, with the comment period being for a period no less than 30 days. Given the urgent housing needs created by the COVID pandemic, requiring PJs to conduct an analysis of local market conditions, amend their con plan, and complete the 30-day public comment period would really cause a significant delay in providing TBRA to those most in need. So the department is suspending the requirement that PJs must, 1, amend their con plan to include or revise an analysis of local market conditions before they can implement a TBRA program, and certify that the use of home funds for TBRA is an essential element of the con plan based on that analysis of local needs. The department is also reducing the public comment period from 30 to 5 days for annual action plan amendments that constitute a substantial amendment under the PJ's definition. This suspension applies to the PJ's current 5-year con plan and any con plan action plans being amended to reprogram home funds for TBRA during the pandemic. PJs must amend their annual action plans to add or increase home funding for TBRA provided during the pandemic, and provide a 5-day public comment period if the action plan amendment constitutes a substantial amendment under the jurisdiction's adopted definition. So to clarify, we've had several questions on this. There's no need to amend the con plan to address or certify to the need for TBRA during the pandemic, but PJs may need to amend the annual action plan to reprogram funds, which may or may not constitute a substantial amendment. If it's a substantial amendment, your public comment period has been reduced from 30 to 5 days. TBRA, tenant selection and targeted assistance. Home requires PJs to develop and implement written tenant selection criteria for its TBRA program that align with the local housing needs and priorities that they had established in their con plan. This suspension allows PJs to rapidly adjust their selection criteria to address the urgent needs of individuals and families affected by COVID-19 financial hardships, without having to ensure that those priorities are in line with the needs established in the comp plan. That said, PJs must still document the criteria that they're going to use to select individuals and families that will receive TBRA during the pandemic and include these written selection criteria in the program file. The suspension is applicable to TBRA provided, again, as I mentioned, during this April 10th, 2020 and December 31st, 2020 timeframe to any eligible individual and family that has experienced financial hardship as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. In accordance with the home regulations at 92209F, or in the case of insular areas, 9264A, PJs are required to disapprove a lease if the rent is not reasonable based on an assessment of rents charged for comparable unassisted units in the area. This waiver will permit PJs to provide TBRA to those most in need during the pandemic by eliminating the need to conduct a rent reasonableness analysis prior to providing assistance. This is particularly important as PJs assist households already housed but who are currently facing financial hardship where the tenant's current rent may not meet the PJ's rent reasonableness standards. This waiver is applicable to TBRA provided, again, through the April 10th through December 2020 timeframe to eligible individuals and families that have experienced financial hardship as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The PJ must execute a rental assistance contract with the tenant or owner, again, for a mutually agreed upon time frame, but not to exceed that December 31st, 2020 waiver period. Eligible home TBRA costs include rental assistance and security deposit payments to income-eligible households, as well as utility deposit assistance if such assistance is provided in conjunction with rental assistance or security deposit payment, with a maximum amount of monthly assistance not to exceed the PJ's rent standard and 30% of the tenant's monthly adjusted income. PJs are also required to establish a minimum tenant contribution to rent and a rent standard that's based on local market conditions or the subsidy standards established under the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. Further, the amount of monthly utility costs included in home TBRA is limited to the utility allowance established by the PJ for its TBRA program. As the pandemic affects the financial stability of individuals and families, we recognize there's an urgent need for an increased level of assistance, as well as the ability to cover additional costs that may not otherwise be eligible under home. So this waiver allows PJs to provide up to 100% subsidy for utilities, including water, power, and or gas, in addition to rental assistance and security deposit payments for new and existing TBRA families affected by the pandemic. So PJs can pay the full cost of utilities even if the utility cost exceeds the PJ's utility allowance. The waiver also eliminates the need for PJs to establish utility allowances for different types and sizes of units. Again, this waiver is applicable to TBRA provided between April 10th and December 31st, 2020 to eligible individuals and families that have experienced financial hardship as a result of COVID-19. The PJ must execute a rental assistance contract with a tenant or owner, again, for the mutually agreed upon time frame not to exceed December 31st, 2020 waiver period. Given the need to socially distance, PJs should develop a process for receiving any and paying any utility costs electronically if possible, and the utility payments can be made directly to the tenant or the utility company, and in all cases, the PJ should maintain records of the payment in the project file. Term of rental assistance contract. When executing a rental assistance contract, home requires the term of the contract to begin on the first day of the term of the lease. HUD realizes that for individuals and families already housed and under an existing lease, but who need assistance to remain in their unit, it's impossible for the rental assistance contract to begin on the first day of the term of the lease. Consequently, this waiver eliminates the requirement that the rental assistance contract align with the first day of the term of the lease. PJs must still execute the rental assistance contract with the tenant or owner for, again, this mutually agreed upon time frame not to exceed the December 31st, 2020 waiver period. As I noted earlier, the PJ does have the option to extend the rental assistance contract beyond December 31st, 2020 waiver period. However, if HUD has not extended these waivers further into next year, the unit and the tenant will have to meet all home requirements after that December 31st, 2020 waiver period. The home regulations require that each home-assisted tenant have a lease that complies with the tenant protection requirements of 24 CFR 92-253A and B, often referred to as prohibited lease provisions. For tenants already housed where an existing lease is in place, it would be administratively burdensome to require tenants and owners to amend leases that may include one or more of the prohibited provisions. Consequently, we're waiving this requirement that the PJ review and amend any lease with prohibited lease provisions prior to providing assistance to individuals affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. That said, we strongly urge you to take action when and where possible to limit prohibited provisions, perhaps through an addendum or some other measure. The goal here is to balance the timely provision of emergency assistance with protecting tenants' rights. It's important to note that PJs must still comply with all Violence Against Women Act requirements, including at a minimum a lease addendum that addresses all VAWA requirements in 92-359. And again, PJs must execute execute a rental assistance contract with the tenant or owner for the mutually agreed upon period not to exceed that December 31st, 2020 waiver period. Housing quality standards. So the reg says that prior to providing TBRA to an eligible household, PJs must inspect the unit to ensure that it meets the housing quality standards of 24 CFR 982-401. Given the urgent housing needs of individuals and families during this pandemic, as well as the necessity to socially distance to prevent the spread of the virus, the department has waived the requirement to conduct an HQS inspection prior to providing TBRA to eligible households. This waiver will enable PJs to rapidly house and assist eligible households while reducing the risk of housing inspectors contracting or spreading the virus. It is important to note that the lead-safe housing requirements in 24 CFR Part 35, Subpart M, cannot be waived. Consequently, units built prior to 1978 must undergo visual evaluation and paint repair in accordance with the lead-based paint requirement. We have been in contact and have had some discussions with the lead office, and I know there have been several questions about remotely conducting inspections using Zoom or some other sort of electronic video app. We have not received guidance on that thus far. The only guidance we can provide is that lead rules still apply, and anything built prior to 1978 must undergo visual inspections and paint repair. The PJs using the waiver authority must establish procedures to minimize the risk that tenants are housed in substandard housing, as well as procedures for conducting physical inspections within 120 days of the end of the December 31st, 2020 waiver period. And this is a slide that Diane also presented earlier, so there's a little bit of overlap. Annual HQS inspections. PJs are required to conduct the annual HQS inspections of units occupied by TBRA recipients. Similar to the waiver of the initial HQ inspection prior to occupancy, this waiver also aims to protect the health of both the inspectors and tenants during the waiver period by eliminating the requirement to conduct annual HQS inspections of occupied units receiving TBRA. The waiver applies to annual HQS inspections of TBRA units from that April 10th, 2020 waiver memo through the December 31st, 2020 waiver period. At the end of the period, PJs must be prepared to conduct HQS inspections of any units that would have been subject to inspection during this period. And finally, income determination. PJs must determine a TBRA tenant's annual income by examining at least 2 months of source documentation and projecting the anticipated income forward for the next 12 months. Given that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused sudden and very dramatic changes in income, requiring PJs to examine 2 months of source documentation really wouldn't accurately reflect the current financial circumstances of many households. So the department is allowing PJs to follow the income determination requirements at 24 CFR 92-203A1 II. And that reg allows PJs to obtain a written statement on the amount of the household's anticipated annual income, their household size, along with a certification that the information is complete and accurate. So instead of requiring 2 months of source documentation, the tenant can provide a self-certification. The waiver applies to households experiencing financial hardship as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and receiving TBRA between April 10th and December 31st, 2020. PJs must ensure that the tenant's self-certification indicates how the tenant's financial situation has changed, such as a job loss or reduced wages, and includes all income received by the tenant as a result of the pandemic. A copy of the tenant's self-certification must be included in the project file. And with that, I will hand it over to Ginny in case we have any additional questions from the chat that we'd like to answer. Ginny?
All right, Ginny, check to see if your phone is muted, Ginny.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes, I had my phone on mute. Sorry about that. So I've been monitoring the chat during the presentation, and I've answered probably a dozen or so questions for folks privately, and also been jotting down notes about some of the common questions that we've been getting. So I will review some of those. In the meantime, I ask OAHP staff, can you continue to monitor chat? And if there are questions that I missed that we should be answering, or if we have time to answer, because we actually have 15 minutes, you know, can you sort of, when I'm done answering the ones that I've written down here, if you can sort of let us know what those questions are and we can try and answer them. So just as a, yeah.
Ginny, I'm sorry. One thing I did see earlier, there were several people questioning whether the slides will be available.
Yes, I did answer that for everybody. So I guess I'll start out by saying that this session is being recorded. It will be posted for on the HUD Exchange once it's available. We will also post the slides, and you know, sort of as a PDF in case you want to use them for reference. And then we are getting a transcript of all of the questions that are coming in on the chat. In addition, we have questions that have been coming in over the last several days at the home COVID-19@HUD.gov mailbox. We may answer some of those individually. Others, we actually are working on FAQs on the waivers and suspensions in addition to the moratorium FAQ. And so we will answer some of your questions as an FAQ as well. So just to be clear, one of the questions that we got is my whole state covered by the disaster declaration? And yes, as these disaster declarations have been issued, they have covered entire states at a time. So even though for those of you who have had disaster declarations for natural disasters in the past that usually just covered part of a state. Right now, all 50 states are covered sort of in all the PJs within those 50 states. So at this point in time, as we mentioned, all of these suspensions and waivers should be available to all of you. So I'm going to answer some of the questions that I saw sort of frequently popping up in the mailbox. So the first question, is there going to be additional home funding? Well, there was no additional home funding in the CARES Act. We were probably one of the few programs in the department that didn't receive supplemental funding. However, I know that there's at least sort of some discussion up on the Hill about whether or not to make additional home funding available. And I think one of the things that may impact that is seeing how much tenant-based rental assistance is being done with home funds, which, you know, if there's a lot of home money being targeted toward that, they may decide that there's need for some additional home funding. Next question, can we give part of the 25% admin to an outside organization to administer tenant-based rental assistance? And the answer to that is yes. You know, it's kind of rare for a PJ to run tenant-based rental assistance itself. Sometimes they use the Public Housing Authority. We frequently see the use of nonprofits to administer TBRA, or depending on the population being served, sometimes it's a county social services agency that does that administration, but you absolutely can contract that out. And that was one of the reasons why we increased the admin set aside as much as we did. Typically, we've never actually increased in any event the admin set aside above 20%, so 25 is a very large amount. And then we got kind of a related question to that, is if you're using a subrecipient, some other outside organization to administer your tenant-based rental assistance, can the TBRA contract be between the subrecipient and the tenant and the owner? And the answer to that is yes. The PJ does not have, when we use PJ in these slides or in the regulation, if a subrecipient is administering the program, then you can generally substitute subrecipient for PJ where you see it. We had a question, can TBRA be for less than 1 year? And the answer to that is yes. Generally, sort of in the home program in normal times, you know, sort of the contracts can be for up to 2 years, and we like to see 1-year leases if at all possible. However, you know, the way that this waiver is written, right now we want these tenant-based rental assistance contracts to sort of only extend to December 31st, and that is because it's unclear to us whether, you know, whether we will sort of extend these waivers to go beyond that. It's a possibility that we may decide to extend the waivers beyond that point. However, sort of whether or not we want to continue to allow TBRA to be provided without inspections, without source documentation, is another question. So at this point in time, if you're doing, if you're doing tenant-based rental assistance, for the most part, it's probably going to be a contract that lasts at the end of the year and can be renewed. But depending on what happens with these waivers, it may be renewed under different, sort of different circumstances or different provisions. Several people have asked in the chat, and also we got this question in the mailbox earlier. Can we pay utilities only with home tenant-based rental assistance? And this is a little bit of a tricky question because our statute specifies tenant-based rental assistance, either ongoing or as security deposit assistance, as the eligible activity for home. and we don't have the authority to sort of create through suspension or waiver a different eligible activity. So while you can pay utilities as part of tenant-based rental assistance or security deposit assistance, you can't run a program that is targeted at paying utilities on behalf of tenants. That being said, given the fact that we have removed, we've removed the rent reasonableness requirement, we've removed the maximum per unit, or excuse me, the maximum subsidy, so you can, and also sort of the limitation of utility allowances. There is probably a way to structure tenant-based rental assistance for a family that ends up paying for their utilities without necessarily paying for their rent. So we will be doing some technical assistance products. We have PA providers who are working on that right now, and sort of different ways to structure that assistance will definitely be one of the things that we cover. Next question, can we pay April 1st rent on behalf of tenants, even though obviously we didn't even issue these waivers until April 10th? This is a question that we have asked our lawyers. I think it would be highly desirable if we could possibly figure out a way to pay, if not months of back rent, at least April 1st rent payments. And so I don't have an answer for that. The only thing I can tell you is if we can figure out a way to make it eligible, we certainly would like to do that. Let's see. We've gotten, a couple people have asked about income targeting, particularly for tenant-based rental assistance. So you all will remember your building home training. 100% of home funds have to be used to assist families at or below 80% of area median income, so low-income families. However, there's a deeper level of income targeting that applies on a grant-by-grant basis, and it applies only to funds used to assist either home rental units or TBRA recipients. So, and this is statutory, and if you'll remember, on the list of statutory things that we can't suspend is income targeting. So there is a requirement on a grant-by-grant basis, so your fiscal year 2017 grant or your fiscal year 2018 grant, that 90% of the funds that you use, or 90% of either the rental units or the TBRA families that you assist with funds out of that grant, assist people or households that are below 60% of area median income. So some of you may shorthand this for what we call 90 at 60 income targeting. So we cannot, there is no way for us to change that. We had one person asking, can we just do 100% below 80? That would be great, but unfortunately it's not within HUD's power to do so. But what I've pointed out to folks, including someone that I had a back and forth with who sent in a question to the mailbox last week, is that if you're dealing primarily with people who've lost all or a large portion of their income, and you're sort of taking their current income, which may be zero, and projecting it forward, and for the most part, we don't have a lot of basis to say that people will be getting their jobs back. You probably, in sort of as a practical matter, will not have that much difficulty ensuring that you're meeting that 90 at 60 income targeting. The other question, and I think Martha addressed this to a certain extent, but it's worth addressing again. The lead-based paint inspections. So for tenant-based rental assistance, visual inspection, sort of a visual evaluation and paint repair is required for tenant-based rental assistance. This by statute, by the lead-based paint statute, is not something that HUD has the authority to waive. or suspend. Even in disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, that kind of thing, lead-based paint requirements can never be suspended. That has the unfortunate effect of sort of limiting your tenant-based rental assistance potentially to units that are post-1978 constructed units. We have gotten some questions from folks who were wondering if video inspections would be acceptable. We have posed that question to the office in HUD that is in charge of lead-based paint, and we haven't heard anything back from them. They were, that was something they were going to talk about. So we will definitely make sure that we circle back with folks and let you know whether we can get any relief on that, but it's not a waivable provision. Let's see. Is there anything else? Oh, one last question, and then if my folks can sort of pipe up with anything you got from the chat that you think is worth answering. I got a couple people who asked whether the eviction moratorium applies to CDBG. And I think the answer to that, or housing that's assisted with CDBG, and I think the answer to that is stay tuned. CDBG is not subject to VAWA. So it is not a covered program under VAWA. So in that sense, it is not, it is not, covered. Whether it would be covered by virtue of something being a federally backed loan is something that the HUD lawyers are going to have to look at and opine on. I suspect that if you have rental projects that were rehabbed with Section 108 loans from CDBG, that's probably going to be covered. I don't know the answer for just a regular CDBG loan for rehab of a multifamily rental. So please stay tuned on that as well. Folks, Diane, Martha, and Peter, Caitlin, Henrietta, do any of you have questions that you've seen in the chat that you'd like to bring forward in the last couple minutes that we have?
Hey, Jenny, there's been a lot of questions about whether or not the increased admin funds or the CHOTO set-aside funds that become un-CHOTO funds, if they have to be used specifically for response to the pandemic or if they can be used for regular home projects and regular home admin.
So there isn't a, the answer is that they're not required to be used specifically for, specifically for pandemic-related activities. However, for instance, for admin, if you're not incurring any additional admin funds and you're not, you weren't using your CDBG or local money somehow or other, you were managing to administer your home program for just the 10%, then you don't have anything to spend the money on. So you don't have, you don't necessarily have to spend the money for COVID-related activities, but obviously you have to be spending that money for eligible activities. I got a question that I answered privately in the chat. If they take their CHOTO set-aside funds and remove the CHOTO set-aside designation, do they have to use it for TBRA? No, they could use it for another project that had nothing to do with COVID. There does not have to be a direct relationship. We probably have time for one other question. Was there something in the chat that that people wanted to bring forward? So somebody is saying, and I can't find it, this one, someone said in the chat that in a different HUD webinar, they said that they said that unemployment does not get counted as income. So the answer to the question is, who's right, the last webinar or this webinar? Well, of course, we're right. Unemployment benefits that people are receiving, whether it's regular unemployment or the enhanced unemployment that people are receiving due to the COVID pandemic, that is counted as income. However, I believe, as Diane mentioned, the stimulus payments are actually not income, and they're not even going to be taxable as income. That's considered to be a sort of a tax credit that we all received up front. So if you're looking to do, if you're doing self-certification of income for people affected by the COVID pandemic, obviously the source documentation that they had for the past 2 months, sort of while they were a waiter or working in retail or something like that, is not relevant. But if they're receiving unemployment, that is something that you should take into account. Okay, we are, I believe, like about a minute past our time. So I do want to reiterate, we are recording this webinar. We will be posting this webinar. We will post these. We will post the slides as well on the Home HUD Exchange. So that's where you will find it. We will also send it out on the HUD, on the Home Program listserv when we posted those things. If you have colleagues who were not able to get in because even with 1,800 slots, apparently we were oversubscribed, they'll have the opportunity to listen to this. We will do our best to answer your questions, either that have come into the Home COVID-19 mailbox, or possibly we may get in touch with some of you directly, or depend that if you put something into chat. However, primarily these questions that we've gotten in the chat, we will be trying to incorporate as many of them as possible into the frequently asked questions that we will be posting on an ongoing basis as they are prepared. Once again, they will be on the Home Exchange website as well. With that, I want to thank you all very much for everything that you're doing on the front lines, and also for the time that you spent with us today. We really appreciate it. Stay well, stay safe, and we will all get through this together. Thank you.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.